Now let's discuss the situation where the button raises and the big blind calls. Flop comes J62. Big blind checks, button bets 33% pot, and the big blind calls. And now we see the turn. Let's go through the equities here. As you can see, the overcards, the ace, king, and queen, are all particularly good for the button player. And also, most of the middle cards are pretty decent as well. Notice the 10, 9, and 8 are pretty good too. That's because these are overcards to the 6. Interestingly enough, the 7's kind of in the middle because the player in the big blind's going to have a lot of hands like 7-6 and Jack-7 and random floats with hands like 8-7 of clubs and whatnot. So the 7's not especially great. And then the low cards are all just really, really bad, right? Because the low cards are going to connect very well with the big blind's check calling range of stuff like 6-4 and 5-4 and all of that, right? Also notice the Jack is not especially great because this is a scenario where the button is going to be continuation betting very frequently. So they'll be betting their jacks, but they'll also be betting a whole lot of other junk. Whereas the player in the big blind, when they check call, they usually have some sort of reasonable draw or some sort of a pair. So you'll see that even the jack is a pretty bad card. So this makes sense, right? On the higher turns, we're going to get to continue betting very frequently, right? Like you see the ace and king and queen, we get to bet 65-ish to 55-ish% of the time. And then on the lower turns, we have to do a little bit more checking, right? So we see a 7, we're checking about half the time. And then the 5, 4, 3, and 2, we're checking about 55 or 60% of the time. And also on the 6, we're also checking pretty frequently. The jack's actually an interesting card because on the jack, we actually do have some nut hands. So we have a bit of a nut advantage here, despite the fact that we don't have great equity. So you see, we still actually get to bet pretty often, about 50% of the time on the jack turn, despite our equity being rather low. And that's because of the bit of a nut advantage we have in that scenario where we have all the best jacks and our opponent has slightly weaker jacks. Okay? So let's take a look at when the turn is the 7 of spades. So this is the very neutral turn. And it's important to remember here that when the button continuation bets in this scenario, they're continuation betting the flop very frequently with a lot of their range, if not all, perhaps all of their range, right? So this is a spot where the button has their entire pre-flop range, or the majority of it, going to the turn, because they would have continuation bet the flop with almost all of it, whereas the player in the big blind does not have their entire pre-flop range because they would fold all of their junk to the flop bet, even to a small flop bet, right? So on the turn, when the turn's a 7, after the big blind checks, this is an interesting spot because notice the player's range on the button, here we just have their entire range, is actually very, very wide, right? And if we go through and categorize the hands as we would logically categorize them, you see that we actually have a few too many draws in this scenario. And also we're already at that roughly 70-30 ratio. So we have a little bit too much junk/draws. The weaker portion of our range is a little bit high. So let's just make sure we've categorized everything correctly and see if we need to change anything. So here we have the premium hands listed as the good jacks and better. Also we have ace 7 listed as a premium hand. I think that's fine. We could perhaps also list some slightly weaker jacks if we felt inclined. We could maybe bet like king 7. These are hands that are often good when they get called, and if they're not, they still have additional outs. You'd rather bet a hand like ace 7 than pocket 10s here, by the way, because ace 7, if you bet and get called by a jack, you still have 5 outs, whereas if you bet 10s and get called, you have 2 outs, right? So those are the premium hands. The marginal hands are going to be most of the 7s, the 6s, the underpairs, the 2s, and then some good ace highs, right? So here I have ace 8 and better listed as a marginal hand. These are hands that I plan on checking behind on the turn, often looking to call a river bet on safe rivers. If it's a bad river, like one that's a lower card, a river that gives us low equity, I'm going to be folding to a bet. But if it's a higher equity river, I'm often going to be calling a bet. And when it goes check, check, you often win with the ace highs in the spot. So those are listed as marginal. They may even be junk, though. You have to understand, this marginal to junk category is kind of fluid to some extent because sometimes you're going to be calling on the river with your bottom pairs if your opponent bets, and sometimes you're not, depending on the river card. We're going to be discussing that when we do get to the river. But do your best to try to structure your range such that it's 70-30. marginal made to junk, and realize that you are going to have to make some somewhat light river calls when your range is very wide, like it is here. As it often will be whenever you raise the button with a very wide range and you get a uncoordinated board. There just isn't naturally a lot of junk in your range. Now, we need to try to find some draws. We need to have about 20% draws. Well, flush draws make a lot of sense. Straight draws, if we have them, make a lot of sense, like 8-5 suited, 9-5 suited, etc. Also 10-9, 10-8, 9-8. And then we have a lot of other effectively junk hands like Queen 10, Queen 9, King 8. These are all hands that I think we actually do need to bluff. And you may say, really? We're bluffing with the Queen and the 9? And the answer is yes. And that's because what else are we going to do with it, right? We could check it back, but then we just have way too much junk, right? So this is a spot where we're going to have to make some sort of a concession between having too many draws and too many junk hands. And in general, whenever you have to pick which range you're going to essentially make a concession with, typically you want to be having a little bit too many draws. And that's because in general, you're going to find that in game, most people just fold too often across the board. And if you let it go check, check, they're going to play the river at least reasonably well. So we're betting pretty frequently in this spot. Notice I also have hands like King Queen to King 9 and Ace 5 to Ace 3 listed as junk. But sometimes these hands win too. If you check, check the turn and it check, checks on the river, sometimes you actually do win with King High. So don't think that the junk just all automatically loses. And you're going to find that's very common in these spots to bet with the hands that lack showdown value, like Queen 10, for example, and check the hands like King Queen that have a little bit of showdown value. And also, we don't really mind betting Queen 10 and getting raised off of it, right? Whereas we don't really want to bet King Queen and get raised off of it because it probably has 2 out, or it has 6 outs, right? 2 overcards. Notice we are only betting the high kings of spades and we're checking the other ones, right? As marginal made, or as junk hands. But we're betting like King 5, King 4, King 3 because these hands lack showdown value. They have less showdown value than these hands. To be fair, like all of these hands towards the bottom, you can certainly mix it up a bit. If you wanted to bet some of them, check some of them, I think it's fine. We do have some just total give-ups on the river. It's fine to have some total junk. I don't have a problem with that. Like 10-5, no draw. It's fine to just give up there. That is a junk hand as well. So as we see, our range is really, really wide. And when it's really, really wide, it's really difficult to balance. And when you're trying to do your best to have the 1-to-1 ratio premium to draw and the 70-30 ratio marginal to junk, if you have to give up somewhere, it's usually going to be in the category where you add just a few too many draws to that category, which is, I think, a good, strong exploit. So notice here, we are betting about 45% of the time. In this scenario, Solver actually bets a touch more. They're betting 49% of the time. So that's cool to see. Notice Solver does bet all the best hands, right? Notice it's betting roughly the same hands I was. Most of the jacks, just the good jacks and better, right? It also bets Ace 7 and King 7 sometimes. Like I mentioned, we could bet the King 7. The lower 7s opt to not bet very often, though. What else is betting? Sets obviously bet. Notice here that random hands with a 5 and random hands with a 4 and random hands with a 3 that lack showdown value do a lot of betting. Notice here I was doing a decent amount of betting here as well, which is good. What's doing a lot of checking? Well, the 7s, the weaker 7s are doing a lot of checking. 6s are doing a lot of checking. Lower jacks are doing a lot of checking. Ace highs are doing a lot of checking, right? And notice we have all of that nailed, which is good. It shows that you can go through, use this strategy, and you'll be pretty close to the solver. There, of course, will be some corner cases as we continue moving forward where perhaps that strategy doesn't line up perfectly, but it's good to see that we're lining up reasonably with this. And notice here, because we're betting a little bit more polarized, right? We're not betting all that often, but we have a lot of high equity hands that want to bet, like these jacks. We're actually betting with a very big size. Notice the solver actually prefers 120% pot on the turn, or 66% pot. It's not going for a small bet here. A lot of people look at this board and think they should be betting small, but that's not true because with a hand like King Jack, you have the best hand by a mile, and whatever your opponent has reasonable equity because they check call the flop, right? So with your best hands, you want to be pushing your equity and just getting money in the pot as a solid favorite. And with your junk, you want your opponent to fold. Notice the small bet size is usually going to be with super nut hands that has your opponent drawing thin, and then also marginal hands. So we have jacks and 7s going for the small bet, and 2s sometimes, 6s sometimes. Also, like Ace 6 and King 7, when it does bet, those hands are using the small bet size too, plus a few sporadic bluffs. Now let's look at the turned Ace. This is a card that is very good for the player on the button because they're going to have a lot of ace highs. right, on the flop when they continuation bet. As you see here, there's a whole lot of premium hands. So now this is going to work out way easier whenever we go about categorizing our hands because we just have a whole lot more premium hands. When you get a turn card that's good for you, life's pretty easy. When you get a turn card that's bad for you, though, life is not easy because you have too much junk. So anyway, let's go through categorize the hands. Just usually the best aces are going to be betting. I have even some jacks betting here, the best jacks. I think this is reasonable. Whenever you are checking, you're going to find that a common strategy here is to check your weakest hands of basically your top pairs and middle pairs that have bad kickers, and the good kickers tend to do a little bit more betting. That said, in this scenario, you may just want to bet all the aces. I would have no problem with that. You may ask, like, is Jack 9 really good enough to value bet here? And I think it probably is, because if you think about it, when the opponent check calls the flop, they probably don't have a ton of ace high. And also, this is a spot where if you bet, you have a pretty big nut advantage here, right? Because we have a whole lot of ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, ace, 6, right? We have a lot of hands like this that our opponent can't really raise against. And the reason you don't want to be betting a lot of middle pairs typically is because if you bet and get raised, it's a disaster, right? But we're not going to get raised here all that often because we have a bit of a nut advantage. So given we have a bit of a nut advantage and a big range advantage, we should not expect to get raised very frequently at all. So this is a spot where we can bet hands like Jack 9 just straight up for value/protection. And that's going to work out pretty well. So these are the premium hands. Marginal hands are going to be mainly 6s, 2s, bad ace highs, right? Under pairs. Makes perfect logical sense. Weaker jacks, did I say that? Weaker jacks too. Draws are going to be diamonds, some diamonds, and then just a bunch of hands that can't win at the showdown, right? Notice here, we have a bunch of junk. Why do we have so much junk? Well, because again, we have a lot of premium hands, right? We have 29% premium hands, so we get to have about 29% draws. Now we have a few too many here. Another adjustment you will see is that when you have a lot of nut hands, like a big nut advantage, you can have a few too many draws as well. That's usually fine. And we're just taking every hand that can't win at the showdown and bluffing it. I know that sounds pretty aggressive, but this is what you should be doing. A lot of people make the mistake here. If they have 10-5, no draw, they just check it. But this is a turn that you need to be betting very frequently because you have so many good hands. All right, and then the junk is all these king highs that can conceivably win at the showdown, right? These are hands that you're going to check behind on the turn and fold to river bet, but if it goes check, check on the river, you actually do win some portion of the time too. So this strategy works out pretty nicely. Let's take a look at what the solver does. It does 30% checking. I was doing 40% checking. So solver actually bets even a little bit more often than I do. Let's see what hands the solver was betting that I'm not. It was betting the lower ace X most of the time too, which, like I said, that was probably reasonable. It's even betting like kings and queens some portion of the time. Notice 10s and lower always do a lot of checking. This is roughly the strategy we were using. It's betting a lot of these low equity hands like 10-5, 10-4, 9-5, 10-7, as it should. I mean, that just makes a lot of sense, again, because it has so many nut hands. And when you are looking at the solver, by the way, don't get too hung up on the fact that my percentages may be like plus or minus 10% of whatever the solver is betting or checking with, because understand that I'm getting to the turn with a different range than the solver, slightly different range, because I am using these 100% frequencies, whereas the solver is doing a lot of mixing, right? Like we see here, solver has almost no ace-7, right? Whereas I had all the ace-7s, right? This is a spot where I was continuation betting the flop very frequently. Looks like solver is doing a little bit more checking, which is fine. I have no problem with this. But it's going to lead to our ranges being slightly different. So if you see some slightly different frequencies as we move forward to additional examples, recognize that's often what is happening. If we had the solver have exactly the same range I was starting with, it would probably give you a very similar output to what I have. But this is a spot where you'll see that the solver is going to start to deviate a little bit from the implementable strategy, because at this point we're starting to have slightly different ranges. That said, all the principles still apply, and you'll see that the solver roughly plays like I'm recommending, which is very good to see.